Disclaimer. This video is a historical documentary created for educational purposes. All scenes are artistic reenactments based on documented events. No real violence is shown or promoted. The courtyard echoed with gunfire as Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu's bodies were ripped apart by bullets on Christmas Day, 1989. Moments earlier, the once untouchable dictator had been shouting defiance. Seconds later, he and his wife lay crumpled in the dirt, executed by firing squad in a blur so chaotic the cameraman barely caught it. How did Romania's self-proclaimed genius of the Carpathians fall from absolute power to a bloody wall of death in less than 72 hours? This is the brutal story of Ceausescu's final hours, an implosion of tyranny that ended in one of the most shocking executions of the 20th century. To really get a handle on the explosion of rage that tore through Romania in December 1989, you first have to understand the 24 years of misery that came before it. Nicolae Ceaușescu took power in 1965, and at first he played the part of a maverick, a communist who marched to his own beat, independent of Moscow. He famously condemned the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, a move that scored him points with the West and a brief wave of popularity at home. But that mask of the moderate reformer would soon slip, revealing the true face of a ruthless tyrant. Ceausescu, with his equally cruel and ambitious wife, Elena, dragged Romania into a bizarre form of national communism. It was a system built on a suffocating cult of personality and crippling paranoia. He wasn't just a leader, he was the conductor, the genius of the Carpathians. His portrait was in every school, every office, every factory. Elena, a woman with little education who was somehow put in charge of the nation's scientific research, was called the mother of the nation. Their smiling faces were everywhere, a constant reminder of who was in charge. But behind this twisted political theater, the Romanian people were living a waking nightmare. In the 1980s, Ceausescu became obsessed with a single goal: paying off Romania's entire foreign debt. To do it, he forced a brutal austerity program on the country that left it in ruins. Food was so strictly rationed that people stood in endless lines for basics like bread, milk, and meat. Electricity and heat were shut off for hours a day, plunging homes into freezing darkness even in the dead of winter. And while his people starved and shivered, Ceausescu was busy with his megalomaniacal building projects like the infamous People's Palace in Bucharest. To build this monstrously huge building, one of the largest in the world, a huge part of the city's historic core was leveled, forcing tens of thousands from their homes. It was a monument to his ego, built on the suffering of his people. Holding this grim reality together was the dreaded Securitate, one of the biggest and most brutal secret police forces in the entire Eastern Bloc. The Securitate had informers everywhere, weaving a web of fear that turned neighbors into spies and children against their parents. A single whisper of dissent, a joke about the conductor, could get you a knock on the door in the middle of the night, followed by interrogation, prison, or worse. Fear was the air Romanians breathed. For more than 2 decades, the system seemed unbreakable. But in December 1989, one single crack was about to bring the whole rotten structure crashing down. The beginning of the end didn't start in the capital. It started in the western city of Timisoara. The trigger was the regime's attempt to evict a popular ethnic Hungarian pastor, Laszlo Tokes, who had criticized Ceausescu in foreign interviews. On December 15th, when officials showed up at his home, they found a small group of his parishioners holding a silent vigil. As word spread, that small protest grew. Romanians and Hungarians stood together, their shared frustration finally boiling over. The protest quickly morphed from defending a pastor into a full-blown anti-government demonstration. For the first time in decades, you could hear chants of "Down with Ceausescu" and liberty in the streets. Ceausescu, who was on a state visit to Iran, was told about the unrest. His orders were simple and savage: crush it. On December 17th, the Securitate and army units opened fire on the unarmed crowds in Timisoara. The city became a war zone. Tanks rolled through the streets as gunfire echoed through the night. Hundreds were killed, their bodies secretly stolen from morgues and dumped in mass graves to hide the evidence. But this time, the terror didn't work. Instead of putting out the fire, the massacre in Timisoara fanned it into a national inferno. News of the killings, spread by word of mouth and foreign radio stations, horrified and enraged the country. The regime tried to cut Timisoara off from the world, but it was too late. The city was now a symbol of both the government's cruelty and the people's courage. When Ceausescu flew back from Iran on December 20th, he was walking into a powder keg. In a televised speech, he arrogantly dismissed the protesters as fascist agitators, completely misjudging the nation's mood. He thought he could calm everyone down with one big, stage-managed rally. It turned out to be a fatal mistake. On the morning of December 21st, 1989, Nicolae Ceaușescu stepped onto the balcony of the Central Committee building in Bucharest. Just like he'd done for years, the regime had organized a massive, spontaneous rally to show popular support and condemn the troublemakers in Timisoara. Tens of thousands of workers were bussed in from factories, handed red flags and portraits of the leader, and told exactly when to cheer. As Ceausescu started his speech, droning on in that familiar, lifeless voice, the usual rehearsed applause began. He promised a tiny, almost insulting, increase in pensions and wages to a nation that had been through a decade of unbelievable hardship. And then, something happened that had never happened before. From a corner of the square, a sound started to spread through the crowd. It wasn't cheering, it was booing. Jeers. Then a chant, quiet at first, but it grew louder and louder. Timisoara! Timisoara! That moment, broadcast live to the entire country, is one of the most surreal in the history of political downfalls. On television screens across Romania, Ceausescu's face just froze. His eyes darted around in pure disbelief. He raised his hand, begging for silence, his voice cracking. "Allo? Allo? Hello? Hello?" he stammered, as if the entire country were just a bad phone line. Next to him, his wife Elena's face was a mask of fury as she hissed at him to get a grip. For the first time, the Romanian people didn't see their all-powerful Dictator as a god. They saw a confused, weak-old man who had lost control. The state broadcast was quickly cut, but the damage was done. The spell of fear that had held a nation captive for a generation was shattered in an instant. The crowd that was brought there to perform their loyalty didn't go home. They poured into the streets of Bucharest, and their numbers swelled as ordinary citizens joined in. The rally that was supposed to be Ceausescu's ultimate show of power had lit the fuse for his immediate destruction. That night, Bucharest erupted as the revolution reached the gates of the palace. The night of December 21st and the morning of the 22nd were a total blur of chaos. Protests spread like wildfire across Bucharest. People threw up barricades. Then came a critical turning point. The defense minister, General Vasile Milea, died under mysterious circumstances after reportedly refusing Ceausescu's order to fire on the crowds. While officially called a suicide, many soldiers believed he was murdered for his defiance. This act pushed rank-and-file soldiers and their commanders to switch sides, joining the revolution and turning their guns against Ceausescu's loyal Securitate forces. By mid-morning on December 22nd, the Central Committee building was surrounded. Tens of thousands of protesters stormed past security cordons and were flooding the building. Inside, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu finally realized it was over. Their only option was to run. They scrambled to the roof where a helicopter was waiting. Archival footage shows the absolute chaos, the terrified couple being shoved into the aircraft by bodyguards, just as the first protesters swarmed onto the rooftop. At 12:06 p.m., the helicopter lifted off, leaving a city in full revolt behind them. Their plan was to get to a loyalist stronghold, but the escape was a complete disaster. They flew first to their palace at Snagov, but had to take off again quickly. The pilot, claiming they were a target for anti-aircraft fire, convinced them he had to land. He put the helicopter down in a field near a road and basically abandoned them. Now, fugitives in their own country, Nicolae and Elena hijacked a car. They bounced from one car to another, but their faces were just too famous. It wasn't long before they were recognized, captured by local police, and handed over to the army, the same army they had commanded just hours before. Their frantic escape had lasted less than 3 hours. They were driven to a small, bleak military garrison in the town of Târgoviște to await their fate. For 3 days, the once omnipotent rulers of Romania were prisoners, held in a bare room under armed guard. The final act came on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1989. With fighting still raging in parts of Bucharest between the army and die-hard Securitate loyalists, the new government decided they needed a quick, decisive end to the Ceausescu era. They were afraid that any delay would just prolong the bloodshed. An extraordinary military tribunal was thrown together inside the Târgoviște garrison. Nicolae and Elena were marched into a makeshift courtroom. The trial itself was a legal sham lasting less than 2 hours. The charges were read out: genocide for the killing of over 60,000 citizens, undermining the state and the national economy, and illegally hiding over $1 billion in foreign banks. The genocide charge was particularly explosive, though it was never made clear if that number referred to the recent violence or all the deaths during their entire rule. Nicolae was defiant. He refused to recognize the court, shouting that he would only answer to the Grand National Assembly and that this was all a coup. Elena, sitting beside him, simmered with rage, occasionally spitting insults at their accusers. There was no real defense. The verdict was decided before the trial even began. The tribunal found them guilty on all charges and sentenced them to death by firing squad. The whole thing was filmed, a grim record of revolutionary justice. The sentence was to be carried out immediately. As they were led into the cold courtyard, their hands were tied. Nicolae asked that they be allowed to die together, a final request that was granted. As they were shoved against a wall, Nicolae reportedly started to sing a verse from The International, the socialist anthem, before defiantly declaring, "We could have been shot without having this masquerade." A squad of 3 paratroopers stood ready. Before the official order was even given, the soldiers opened fire. The execution at 2:50 p.m. local time was so fast that the cameraman only managed to film the final volley of shots as their bodies crumpled to the ground. In under a minute, the 24-year reign of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu was over, ending in a chaotic spray of bullets against a cold barracks wall on Christmas Day. The fall of Ceausescu was one of the most violent and rapid of the 1989 revolutions. What do you think? Was this swift, brutal execution a necessary act to end a civil war, or was it a denial of true justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you find these deep dives into the pivotal moments of history compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Hours after the execution, the new government broadcast grainy footage of the trial and, more importantly, of the Ceausescu's lifeless bodies on national television. The shocking images did their job. They proved to the Romanian people and the remaining Securitate fighters that the dictator was really dead. While the fighting didn't stop overnight, it broke the back of the loyalist resistance. The Romanian Revolution was the bloodiest of the 1989 upheavals, with over 1,100 people killed. The majority of those deaths, over 700, tragically occurred in the chaos after. Ceausescu had already fled Bucharest. The hurried trial and execution remain controversial. To many, it wasn't justice, it was a lynching. But leaders of the new government argued it was a necessary evil, a sacrifice needed to prevent a full-scale civil war that could have cost countless more lives. The bodies of the Ceausescus were buried secretly in unmarked graves in Bucharest. For years, their final resting place was the subject of myths, and even their own children doubted they were really there. Finally, in 2010, their remains were exhumed for DNA testing to confirm their identities before being reburied together under a simple headstone. The brutal last hours of Nicolae Ceaușescu are a chilling reminder of how fragile absolute power can be. In just 3 days, a man who was treated like a god was transformed into a hunted fugitive, a defendant in a show trial, and finally, a corpse in a dusty courtyard. His fall wasn't just the end of a man. It was the violent, bloody collapse of a system built on fear and the first painful breath of a new, free Romania.